I see Amy Alberts in the chat from here in Central Iowa. You know, let's see, it was February of 2019. We had the climate revival at Plymouth Church and the Des Moines Interfaith Green Coalition, and so many others partnered with that event. We're looking forward to, in the coming year, to be in person again. But we appreciate everyone showing up today as we still try to figure out how to move past this pandemic, that people are willing to join us virtually and be safe and still celebrate how we're called to climate action. Amy was so instrumental in organizing that climate revival in 2019. So many people in the Iowa Interfaith Power and Light Network from around the state helping us empower Iowans of faith and conscience to take bold and just climate action. So in just a minute, I'm going to turn it over. In fact, I'm going to turn it over right now. So I want to welcome everyone, turn it over to Parker Laney, who's going to do our official welcome.
All right, hello and welcome to the 2021 Interfaith Power and Light Called to Climate Action event. On behalf of all Iowa IPL staff and the student leaders, thank you guys all for coming. My name is Parker Laney. I'm a senior at Coe College and a Called to Climate Action student leader. A few things to note before we are opening with reflection. So we're using Zoom webinar, which means that we won't have audio or video. So if you have any questions during Q&A time, please write your questions in the Q&A located like the bar down at the bottom of the Zoom screen or in chat. We're also live streaming to Iowa IPL's Facebook page. If you get kicked off, and we will be recording this event, which will be shared on our YouTube channel later next week. Any general questions can be asked in the chat box. And then I'd like to introduce my fellow student leader, Clara Miller, who is going to lead us in reflection.
Hello, my name is Clara Miller, and I am a sophomore at Iowa State University, and I am a Called to Climate Action student leader. I invite you to join me in a time of reflection. Today I will be reading a poem by Christy Ann Martine. When the world moves too fast and you lose yourself in the chaos, introduce yourself to each color of the sunset. Reacquaint yourself with the earth beneath your feet. Thank the air that surrounds you with every breath you take. Find yourself in the appreciation of life. Thank you for joining me in reflection and coming together in the spirit of climate action.
Thank you for that wonderful opening reflection, Clara. My name is Allie Parker, and I'm the new program associate at Iowa IPL. For those who are just getting to know our organization, we are a faith-rooted nonprofit that empowers Iowans of faith and conscience to take bold and just action on the climate crisis. One of the ways we do this is through our Call to Climate Action student leadership program. In 2019, Iowa IPL brought together our first cohort of Call to Climate Action student leaders. Our students worked together to write Iowa IPL's yearly environmental justice faith statement and plan our annual Call to Climate Action event. They are given time to learn about other traditions, reflect on their own, and integrate faith and climate action. As someone who minored in environmental science when I was an undergrad, it's a pretty cool program that I wish I had participated in when I was at Simpson College. You've heard from both of them, but I'd like to introduce Clara and Parker, our 2021 Call to Climate Action student leaders.
Hello, my name is Clara Miller. I'm from Colo, Iowa, and currently in my sophomore year at Iowa State, majoring in animal science. I found out about the Call to Climate Action program through a friend of mine and was really eager to apply. Up to this point, I had not had an opportunity to do true climate work, so as I looked through Iowa IPL's website, I was really intrigued and wanted to be a part of it. Over the summer, I grew both in my faith and in my knowledge of how best to move forward into climate action. I gained a lot of confidence in the work I was doing and learned how to connect my faith with what I was doing outside of the church. This is an opportunity I would recommend to others due to the direction it gave me through outreach experiences and the growth I made in 3 short months, both in my faith and the confidence I now have to continue the discussion and action around the climate crisis.
Hi, I'm Parker Laney. I'm from Minooka, Illinois, and I'm a senior in my last semester at Coe College. I'm majoring in religious studies, and I have a minor in history. And I applied to the student leadership program because the chaplain at Coe, who's Malia White, sent me an email to all students about the opportunity, and I was immediately interested. I've been passionate about protecting the environment, and I love to explore the connection between faith, where we are called to be stewards of creation, and living in the 21st century working to combat the climate crisis. And Iowa IPL just seemed like the perfect calling. This summer, my faith was deepened as I became more aware of how other leaders of faith were using their voices and positions to call for climate action. And I was able to connect my faith more to everyday life and think about the role the church and faith leaders play in inspiring everyone to take a more active role in restorative action. I think others should apply because the opportunities and experience gained have been very valuable in developing my own personal faith, and I was better able to learn how to organize and make a difference in my own community.
Thank you, Clara and Parker. And thank you everyone for joining us. And it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. Chris Gloninger has spent his career serving the public in responding to and understanding extreme weather. While many meteorologists have avoided the hot topic of climate change, Chris has embraced a deep understanding of climate and the impacts humans have in shaping a changing global climate. Chris grew up in Sag Harbor, New York. He received his BS in meteorology from Plymouth State University and was awarded a CBM, that's Certified Broadcast Meteorologist, from the American Meteorological Society, where he presently serves on the broadcast board. In college, he worked as a traffic control officer in his hometown and as a fireman in Plymouth, New Hampshire. Chris has always been interested in keeping viewers safe. He earned his MS in emergency management from Millersville University, focusing on climate mitigation and adaptation. Chris's career has taken him to Rochester, New York, Albany, New York, Saginaw, Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Boston, Massachusetts. And most importantly, Chris is now our meteorologist at KCCI Channel 8 in Des Moines. Thank you, Chris, for joining us this morning to share how you are called to climate action and for challenging all of us to embrace our own call to action. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Matt. And thanks everyone for joining today on a Saturday, on a beautiful Saturday. And as Matt mentioned, this really is the first true taste of fall out there after such a warm autumn that we've had so far. And I recently crunched the numbers for one of the weathercasts earlier in the week. And so far, this is in the top 5 spots for warmest falls on record across most of the state. So I want to share my screen and we can go over my call to climate action. So let's get started. This is me back in 1991. For a lot of meteorologists, we have some kind of event that triggered our passion or our interest in weather. And for me, that was Hurricane Bob in August of 1991. And then a couple of months later, we're almost at that anniversary, the perfect storm, which if you've watched the movie is a true weather event that happened. And that again was an event when I was just in 2nd grade. So you can actually just see the joy as a 2nd grade future meteorologist in the wind and some of the other events that you'll see here. Thanks to my parents for taking those old home videotapes and putting them to digitizing them so we can access those clips, which is pretty cool. So after that, it was kind of a struggle. I was never great at math, and it's something I wanted to do since 2nd grade, as you just saw. So I needed to get good at math, and I didn't let that obstacle get in the way. What I found that meteorology is essentially 90% math, and it makes sense if you think about it because of the trends that we're seeing. Looking at the 3-dimensional atmosphere, it all takes math, whether it's figuring out the forecast or piecing together the climatological data to show us the trends that we're seeing because of climate change. Grad school, I was a non-traditional student because if you look at that date there, December 2018, that's when I received my interdisciplinary master's degree in emergency management, which focuses on climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. And again, I know those terms are used frequently, and there really isn't a concrete definition that's used when those terms are thrown around, but mitigation is essentially cutting the emissions, cutting the problem before it gets worse. And adapting is building seawalls, for example, and taking other measures in order to protect against the inevitable changes that we will see. Even though we're making progress in cutting carbon dioxide emissions, there's already warming that is baked into the atmosphere, that there's change that's unavoidable at this point. Now it's just up to us to figure out how much change is okay before we take some serious climate action, not just as a country, but also globally. I've had a lot of stops along the way, and this is, I think, my first step. This was my first step in my call to climate action, because the first station that you see there on the upper left-hand side was in Rochester, New York. The station would not allow me to cover climate change. And my views on climate change since college, we had a professor who I admired and I had great respect for, because he essentially started the program at my university, was very skeptical of science. One of my first mentors in this industry denied the science of climate change. And actually, fast forward, that same person unfollowed me on Twitter when I became very outspoken on climate change and tying it into my weathercasts. So that was my first job in Rochester. And then I moved on to another Channel 10, and that was in Albany, New York, where the financial collapse in the early 2000s basically had them eliminate the weekend newscast. I was the weekend morning meteorologist there. And then I made my first Midwest stop in Saginaw, Michigan, followed by a return to Albany to the CBS affiliate, and then out to Wisconsin at the sister station of where I'm currently at. KCCI, WISN is also the Hearst-owned station. They own numerous stations across the country. And that's one of the reasons why I got this job here, because my time in Boston, one of the competitors was another sister station to KCCI. And it was there that I really started my climate coverage. And it brings us to today, where since July 2021, I've been the chief meteorologist here at the CBS affiliate. I know there are people from all across the state that are listening, but this is the Central Iowa CBS station here in Des Moines. Matt mentioned that I was a board member, that I am a board member on the American Meteorological Society. That is our professional organization. And I thought it was important to look at the statements on climate change. And the first statement that the organization issued was back in 2007. And you can see that a piece of it, at least over the last 50 years, human activities are a major contributor to climate change. And that language was turned up a bit in 2012. It is clear from extensive scientific evidence that the dominant cause of the rapid change in climate of the past half century is human-induced increases in the amount of atmospheric greenhouse gases. All right, so that was a big, pretty significant change in language. Might not seem that significant, but it was. And then in 2019, reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emitted by human activity and or accelerating the removal of these gases from the atmosphere is the only way to avoid much of the projected warming. So let me see here. All right. When I started out 16 years ago at that station in Rochester, I was not allowed to cover it, even though there were clear indicators that this was going to be an issue. Again, my thoughts were, maybe you could say, contaminated a little bit, and I didn't see the urgency in covering it as well because of who was around me and who my mentors were. But then I started to do research on my own. I started to connect the dots because after all, with my background in meteorology, this is the science that looks at climate change, right? It's the study of the atmosphere. So I pitched it mid-career, and if there are any journalism majors out there, you know that this is not accurate. Both sides needed to be represented. That in journalism is what's known as a false balance. And there's a pretty telling soundbite that I'm going to play in just a second from a gentleman that I've had numerous times. I've used his expertise during my stories on climate change. So let's fast forward to just a handful of years ago, about 5 years ago. I went to Boston in 2019. So it took a little while, it took a lot of convincing still, but in 2019, while I was in Boston, this isn't to pat myself on the back, but it's also to spotlight that this was the first weekly series on climate change that we've had on air during our evening newscasts. Yes, it was local news, but this was really a first in the country. There were meteorologists doing what I'm doing here in Des Moines, connecting the dots, but these stories were diving into the science and explaining how the impacts of climate change are here and now, not something that is 20, 30, 50, 100 years down the road. And it's not just happening in the North Pole and South Pole. The impacts are happening where people live. And we had the vision, an executive producer and I had the vision of telling a unique series or a unique story behind climate change that wasn't just scientifically driven, but people driven, to tell that story, how people are being affected by climate change. Then 2020 happened. Like everything else, everything went to COVID. As a scientist, I kind of hit my head against the wall a few times because it was disheartening, because you can have other crises happening at the same time, not just the health crisis, but this wasn't going away. The time scale certainly is a lot shorter with COVID and a health pandemic versus climate change, which is over the course of years, but it had to go on hold. So I was trying to think of another way to advance this messaging, how to get this communicated effectively while people are, hearing constant, updates on the pandemic, on, what's closed and travel restrictions. So I launched a weekly Coffee and Climate Facebook Live with my colleague, the evening meteorologist in Boston. So I produced with weekly guests, with some of the top climate headlines that were going on, whether that be research or maybe more intense storms that were affecting certain areas. I made those ties, and it was a half-hour program every single week, and we kept it going for about 6 months until I could get back out into the field to start covering these stories again. But also during that time, I was able to produce 2 30-minute documentaries, which looked at this is actually just after the murder of George Floyd. I wanted to do something that was more than just a 2-minute story on air. I wanted to take a serious look at how Black and brown communities especially are hit first and worst by climate change. And it stems back to the old redlining laws, which with the Fair Housing Act were supposed to go away. But I did research into seeing that those same communities that were redlined back in the early 1900s still had the same problems in the 2010s and in 2020. That was one of my most proudest segments that I created, that 30-minute documentary. And then the next 30-minute documentary was on clean, green, renewable energy, and how in the rollout of using renewable energy, it needed to be a socially just transition to clean energy, right? Because a lot of times those programs were rolled out in communities that, maybe were more affluent. They weren't putting up solar panels in neighborhoods that had public housing, for example. And incomes of some of these families that lived in low-income housing. About 30% of their income went to heating and cooling costs. So it looked at not just the renewable energy and the process to getting to all renewables, but it also looked at how we needed to do it, keeping minority communities, these environmental justice communities, front and center in the process. And this was a great article. This was just in the Capital Weather Gang in the Washington Post, and that headline. I don't know why more people don't understand that, the important part that we can play. There are so many sciences that are connected to climate change, but yet this is the degree, this is the science that looks at the atmosphere. This is climate change. A lot of what we do, I know, is future driven. You know, when you look at and make a forecast, it's for maybe a week or 2 weeks, maybe a seasonal forecast, but this is still atmospheric data that's telling the story of climate change. So for me, I went from having a mentor that denied climate change to doing my own research, and then in a 2-year span covered 2 truly historic events. One made national headlines, and that was Superstorm Sandy, and that's the picture I took on the right-hand side. But the other one happened in upstate New York, which, much like Iowa, if there are big weather events that are not the derecho, typically don't make national news. Same thing with upstate New York. Once you go 20 minutes north of the city, that's considered a very rural area. Well, during Hurricane Irene, 18 inches of rain fell across an area that the soil was not very porous, meaning it runs off. It's very steep terrain going from the mountains into a valley. And we had multiple valley communities that were essentially wiped away. This house, you can see, a 2-story house, the first half the floor was taken out and it just landed there. Other communities were hit extremely hard. This was in Prattsville, New York, and it was the communities throughout the Schoharie Valley. There was just widespread devastation. And then just fast forward to 2012, also coming up on the anniversary of Superstorm Sandy. There was a 9-foot storm surge into parts of New York City and New Jersey. That picture that I took is of a Papa John's that was in the middle of a 1-block radius in Queens, New York. There wasn't any FDNY, NYPD blocking off the block, because multiple blocks looked like this. Multiple neighborhoods looked like this across the city, from Staten Island into Queens. It was so overwhelming that they couldn't go to every single call or every single emergency that was out there. A city like New York being overwhelmed, I think that was such a shocking visual for me. So then I started to say, well, we just had these 2 events. I lived through Hurricane Bob and the perfect storm that happened, okay, within a few months of each other, but waited essentially many years to see another significant weather event. And then we had one in Irene, and then we actually had one a little bit later in the summer, Hurricane Lee, which produced devastating flooding, and then Superstorm Sandy. And then after Sandy, we had a nor'easter that produced snow in early November all the way down to New York City. And that was bizarre. So these were some of the climate connections that I was seeing and experiencing. And then when I went to Boston, I covered a lot of these events out in the field. So outside of the studio, I was, if you look at the Weather Channel and you see the meteorologists that are out there, that was the job I had for NBC Boston, but it was also the job I had for the NBC owned stations. So the stations that are owned by NBC, Universal, Comcast across the country, I would go and cover hurricanes. So I'll just play this. This is kind of a montage of events that were either caused by or exacerbated by the climate crisis.
That is seawater being picked up by that SUV. And you can see a few minutes from high tide, we have salt water coming up and into the roadway. We're going to be in this for quite a while. The wind damage is extensive on the ride here. We've seen trees down, power lines down. A street sign right in front of me. Look at that. You can see no, must say no parking. This car encased with ice. Listen. That's because the floodwaters came into this parking lot, this uprooted locust tree, not one, but check this out, 2 of them on the same property, both of these trees landing on the same house. The house next door also seeing some significant damage. This is a driveway, and those are garage doors. The driveway's literally gone. The bricks from that driveway ended up washing across the street. You can see what hours of splashover can do. This is pavement. I'm digging down about 3-4 inches of sand and seaweed covering the roadways. These waves were about 9 to 10 feet high. Look at the damage to this building that was boarded up in preparation of the storm. The front half of the roof peeled off and landed here. When you have a storm sitting off the coast for 2 days with an onshore wind, it turns the ocean pretty much into a washing machine. 2,200 customers still without power. You can see this oak tree that is uprooted, landed on the house. The tree next to it cracked about 3/4 of the way up, but the damage doesn't stop there. So we're going to show you a little bit around this neighborhood. I'm going to take the spotlight and kind of give you a bit of a tour. So this is 20 Millbrook, and you can see there is another oak limb that has toppled over. We'll look down the driveway and you can see we actually just heard a tree snap and crash literally as we were coming on the air.
So just quickly, one of those events was Hurricane Harvey, 40 to 50 inches of rain in a couple of days, causing devastating flooding. A once in a 500-year event. I found out that they had about 3 once in a 500-year event happen in the course of a year. Storms, because of rising sea level, are producing coastal flooding, which actually took out the T, which is the subway system in Boston during the initial live shot that you saw. With a warmer ocean, we're allowed to have these tornadoes and severe weather events across parts of southeastern Massachusetts that wouldn't have happened, or to the frequency, they wouldn't have happened to that scale to what we were seeing when I left just earlier this year. So those were all either caused by or exacerbated by the climate crisis. Now, this is Dr. Anthony Leiserowitz, who, if you've been involved in climate change, you may have seen and heard of their work from the Yale program on climate change communication. And this question just might seem silly, but would we interview tobacco companies in order to be fair and balanced? No, smoking causes cancer, right?
Scientists in the climate community are more confident that climate change is real and is human caused than the medical profession is that smoking causes cancer. And yet most of us don't understand that because there's been a very active and sophisticated disinformation, misinformation campaign by certain actors that have, a very strong direct stake in the profitability of the current energy system.
Wow. So something that we think is so obvious, and I'd say most people would think is so obvious, is smoking causes cancer, but yet atmospheric scientists have more data to show the connections that smoking causes climate change. I don't want to get political because that's part of my job. I'm a journalist, but at the same point, I think it's important to connect the dots. In the last handful of years, I'm sure you heard the pretty devastating headlines about what's going to be happening to the climate agenda, or potentially could happen to the climate agenda. If you connect the dots, Salon Magazine did a tremendous article on Joe Manchin and the $5.2 million he made off his coal company. There are the number of people that work in coal in this country can fit into Gillette Stadium. I know you're probably not all Patriots fans, but that was a stat that I learned when I was covering climate change in Boston. But if you go to Iowa City, where the Hawkeyes play, imagine that's the coal workers in the entire country. That's not to say we can turn our backs on them, but at the same point, we can retool, we can get creative, we can re-educate, we can give retirement packages. But it just is so important to make that transition. from fossil fuels to wind to solar to biofuels. It's critical. And this is pretty telling because you wouldn't give the tobacco companies a mouthpiece, but yet what's been driving the misinformation campaign is the fossil fuel industry.
Scientists.
So do people want to hear about it? That is climate change in the news. I'm a little skeptical of these numbers. I think they're a little too optimistic, but this again is done by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and the George Mason Center for Climate Change Communication. 74% of Americans feel that they want to hear about global warming. They want to hear about climate change during their newscasts. That's not really happening across the country. There are some meteorologists, some colleagues that are doing tremendous work, but it's not being done enough. But look at Iowa. It's not a lighter shade of orange, which means there's a decent amount of people that want to hear about it. So let's look a little bit closer. An estimated 74%, so this is the national average. Iowa's a good representation of that. Want to hear about it on the news, that climate change is or is not happening, right? So that's a pretty high percentage. And people think it's just politics. It's a political issue. And I'll show you some of the response and pushback that I've received because it is a little bit disheartening. But this is a little concerning, I think. And I think that as a state, we could do a little bit better, a lot better, because that number shrinks down to 57% of people who think that it's anthropogenic climate change, human-caused climate change because of our carbon emissions as a country or as a world. So that is below the national average. But this is interesting and it's promising. In Iowa State survey from just 2020, surveyed Iowa farmers and looked at climate change. And you can see the 2011 numbers, 2013, 2020. Again, a lot of room for improvement and in better communicating the science of climate change to help the understanding. And you never want to be all high and mighty and talk down to people and say, oh, well, you're dumb, you don't understand the science. No, you find ways to connect and you'll be provided those ways and those opportunities to connect with somebody. And I encourage all of you to connect because you can make a difference. So look at the percentage of farmers that were surveyed. If climate change is caused mostly by humans, 18% now feel that it's largely anthropogenic. And then 40% think that it's equally natural and human caused. Of course, there's some part of it that's natural, right? When you have a volcano erupting, there are ways to connect, to make natural connections as well. But overwhelmingly, the evidence shows that humans are the cause. And then you see, unfortunately, it drops off to it's mostly natural. There's insufficient evidence, but those numbers have been shrinking. That's down to 16%. You have to really be out of the loop to not really at least acknowledge that something is brewing and something is changing. And this is just released back in September. Also encouraging news that it may not be as political. Conservative Republicans are up to 17% when it comes to wanting climate action. Moderate Republicans or liberal Republicans, about 45%. And then certainly your moderate Democrats, your liberal Democrats are a lot higher on that list. But there is an upward trend, which is encouraging. Are people watching and do they care? Yes. And this is the part of the presentation where I hope that I can inspire. If you already have felt that call to climate action, maybe adding to what you're doing, because this is really important. And I can't stress this enough. This was in Boston and here in Iowa. This is kind of a mix that people are noticing, that people are watching. You know, just a quick note to tell you that I really appreciate your weather reporting. You provide details and cause and effect information, such as where the next weather system is coming from and what may affect or change the forecast. One thing I especially appreciate is the way you frequently point out how climate change is affecting our weather. Just had NBC 10 Boston, had to turn up a volume. Shout out for running a feature on climate change and the disinformation campaign impacting public opinion. I like how you present the weather facts as you reference climate change. Thank you very much, Chris Gloninger, for pointing out how climate change is affecting our weather. Some of us in central Iowa have waited for years for climate realities to be acknowledged during weather broadcasts, and what you're doing is great. Sorry, I don't have my glasses on, but love that you're taking what's happening seriously and putting climate into context for TV viewers. So anyone watch Jimmy Kimmel when he has the segment Mean Tweets? I have a little bit of a bone to pick with the Yale program on climate change communication, because I think that this has been overwhelming. There's been supportive emails, but there's been a lot of hate in the connections that I've been making. I haven't gone in depth with the stories and the documentaries that I produced in Boston, because I'm a chief meteorologist here. And again, it's not as much time, and there are other tasks that I need to do, from scheduling to, you know, coaching teammates and just a couple of examples. But I'm making connections with the data. You know, how much above average are we? You know, an atmosphere that's warmer holds more moisture because of climate change. Showing the relationship between carbon dioxide emissions and increasing temperature. And these are just some of them. After years of mostly factual reporting of the weather, you needed to hire a new weather forecaster, meteorologist, due to retirements of those positions. Very seldom was climate change or global warming presented as a weather influence. The new chief weather forecaster now repeatedly injects his views of climate change in the forecasts he presents. This being repeated with such forecasts on each news broadcast that he presents the weather. This being repeated with each forecast on each news broadcast that he presents the weather forecast. Do you think his views on the issue should be pressed on your station? I think he's pressing the issue too hard and should just forecast the weather as was done in the past. This message is to complain about the new weatherman on the 5 p.m. news and his habit of spewing climate change talking points without proper background and reference. I do not watch Channel 8 to get a liberal view of the weather, and I will not do it in the future. He should keep his political views to himself and just report the weather. Let's focus on an accurate forecast. God knows you need the help, and don't throw in your opinion about climate change. I like your weather forecast, but I hate having to listen to your climate change BS. Can you please stop touting climate change? Actually, it's got another couple. It's been a rough, actually, 2 weeks, but this is what we're getting. This is what I get on the regular. And if you go to the doctor with various symptoms and you say, I have a cough, I'm sneezing, I'm nauseous, and the doctor just says, you have a cough or sneezing, well, that wouldn't be the doctor doing their job. That is a doctor just simply listing some ailments. I think I actually have a woodpecker that's tapping at the door. Not exaggerating. I don't know if you hear that. There's a woodpecker pecking at our door. So apologies. So I was like, what is that noise? So a doctor wouldn't be doing their job if they just simply listed the ailments, right? So they would just be simply saying or copying what you just said and repeating it back to you. So that is what I'm doing as a meteorologist. I'm making those connections, these weather anomalies that are happening. I'm connecting the dots because that is my job. I have to find the reason why we're seeing this. I can't just say it's warmer, moving on. That's important, not just for me, but for any meteorologist. And if you're covering climate change, the neat thing is there are just so many ways to tell the story. And these are just a handful of stories that I covered: mitigation, technology, the green movement, research, policy, activism, renewable energy, future impacts, adaptation, current impacts. And I think that was the biggest concern from management is, well, if we start a series, are you going to run out of ideas? It was overwhelming. I had just probably at once 5 to 6 stories in my head lined up, ready to go. So no, it's impossible to run out of ideas. So this is a question for you. How can your future profession help solve the climate crisis? And I think that's what's inspiring. And when I covered this series, I had my boots on the ground and I was seeing what people were doing to help advance the research into the climate crisis. And there were so many professions that were represented. People in public works having to look at their infrastructure and how to increase drainage capacity, storm drains, because we're seeing increased heavy rain events. Doctors who are seeing an increase in patients with respiratory and cardiac related illnesses, and that are oftentimes made worse due to heat. You have insurance companies that are now having to charge larger premiums because of climate change, and they can't really keep up with the losses. Veterinary medicine. How do we solve some of those issues with methane production when it comes to animals? It's just overwhelming, but it's inspiring at the same time. And to think that, yes, this is an atmospheric science, but this is something that can be worked on by nearly every profession. And I think that that's what gets me most excited. So how can you help? And I've been using this information, recycling it, these last couple of slides, for other presentations. But I think it's important because I think a lot of people call out the media for not doing enough, for not covering it, by putting a spotlight on the lack of coverage. Out of 1,000 stories on Hurricane Ida, only 4% covered climate change. And they only look at the national network coverage of climate change. But most people get their news through local news. They get their national news through their phone, just by going on the internet and looking at top headlines. So what's being done on a local level, I'd argue, is more important than what's being done on a national level. And as people who are called to climate action, it's important to make sure that you're holding people to that, making sure that meteorologists are connecting the dots, whether you live in the Quad Cities, whether you live out in the Omaha market, which covers Western Iowa as well. Make sure that those meteorologists are making those climate connections, but also elevate the people that are making those connections, because that is so important. I'd say that that's even more important than calling out. Be positive, lead by example, show what's being done right. We're supposed to build people up. Tearing them down and saying you are not doing it. I hate to say don't do that, because I think, again, it's important to make sure people are doing it, but do it in a way that you're encouraging them. Don't say you're not doing it. Say, hey, such and such does this. It would be great if you could do it as well. Find ways to be positive about it, because it's not easy. Getting emails like that almost daily, you get a thick skin, but you hit a breaking point as well. And know that it's a ratings-driven industry. And I know I'm being able to reach out to a lot of younger folks right now. And remember, what we do is ratings-driven. If people aren't watching, if people are only emailing those negative emails, I am confident, because I've done this for 16 years, they'll say, you really got to stop doing this as much. You can't make the connections as much. And I know a lot of young people are proud to say that they've cut the cord, but look, we're on the front lines. We're doing this. I encourage you to watch your newscasts, your local newscasts. Just do one, or even, a couple a week, not even nightly. But remember, our salaries are paid through advertisers. That's how we make our money. And if people aren't watching, then we don't get advertising. And then that gets cut. Meteorologists are one scientist aside from doctors that people encounter on a regular basis. And we're that connection for people to help understand the climate crisis. So for those of you who aren't on social media, I encourage you to have your voice heard, because that is one way to get the message out. Because there are a lot of haters out there. There are a lot of people, that 10%er who are dismissive of climate change are the loudest. So we have to counter those voices. Because if you go online and you go on Twitter and you go on Facebook, you sure think it's a whole heck of a lot larger than 10 people who are dismissive, 10% of people that are dismissive of climate change. All right. So I encourage you, if you have questions, if you have examples of how you make the connections. I post it regularly. Those are my social media sites that you can find me, connect with me. I even did TikTok, which I swore that I would never do, but I've been trying to do creative climate stuff using TikTok. So, because again, as part of my job, I think you need any and all ways to help educate people. So I will hand it back over to, I believe, Matt.
It's me now.
Oh, Allie, hi.
Well, thank you so much for that, Chris. Thank you so much for sharing. We are incredibly grateful to have you here with us today and in Central Iowa and just in Iowa in general. It's wonderful to have you. Once again, my name is Allie Parker, the Program Associate here at Iowa IPL, and it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator and two panelists today. So first up is our moderator, Kent Ferris. Kent serves as the Director of Social Action for the Diocese of Davenport and is a deacon candidate. His care for creation is rooted in Franciscan spirituality as a professed secular Franciscan for over 31 years. And our first panelist is Reverend Bridget Stevens. She is the Executive Conference Minister of the Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota Conferences of the United Church of Christ. She cares deeply about empowering others to live their fullest lives by seeing themselves as divine beings, integrally connected with all of God's creation. And our second panelist is Dr. Jen Sand. Jen is a native of beautiful Northeast Iowa and is now a licensed psychologist in private practice in Des Moines. Jen is trained to be a climate reality leader through the Climate Reality Project and is an Iowa IPL board member. Thank you so much for participating, all three of you, and I can't wait to hear your responses today.
I think I'm supposed to begin. Again, I'm Kent. I live in Muscatine. I think anytime you volunteer or take the invitation to become a moderator, you don't want to be as consumed with writing notes, copious notes, as the presenter is giving it. Remarkable presentation, Chris. I really appreciate it. A very quick shout out to my alma mater, Coe College. It is all part of our liberal arts education. And I think there is a former classmate of mine, a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine from my days at Coe, who 10 years ago authored a book, and it talked about how we can see climate change in the changing patterns in agriculture. And so if you're ever interested, the book is Chasing Chili's Hotspots Along the Pepper Trail. And one of the three authors is the late Kurt Michael Fries. It's a great read, and it kind of resonates with some of what we're getting as far as questions about how to reach into the rural areas. My responsibility within our faith tradition is for the 22 counties of Southeast Iowa. And we are often reminded that we are more than the county of Scott, which means that there are 20 rural counties in our diocese, and how climate change is affecting them is different than those that live in urban areas. I would say, as far as our faith tradition's involvement in these matters and why I was writing so fast and seeing great resources at the very highest level at the Vatican. The call is to do a program over a 7-year period of time looking at energy sustainability. And this is a challenge that will allow us to be good neighbors and to do as people from other faith traditions are doing, all people of goodwill are committing to. I'm going to stop though, because I have a tendency to go on too long. And I believe that it may actually be Reverend Stevens who's next. So I'm going to be my best moderator and say, Reverend.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris, for setting us up with just really helpful, informative, and really making tons of connections for us today. I really appreciate that. For me, my sense of call for caring for climate comes frankly rooted in some of the key sentence that you said, Chris, which is around justice. When you said that people of color are hit first and worst by climate change effects. And so understanding that my sense of call, and frankly, my privilege as a person, a white person in the Protestant Christian faith, right? Understanding my place in the whole milieu of creation is that it's actually my responsibility to leverage all of the points of privilege that I have to care for every single other human and frankly, all of creation. That's what my faith teaches me. And also I have to own my parts of confession of that I wasn't, it takes learning and unlearning and relearning and unlearning, right? So I was so thankful for your presentation too, about reminding us that there's the science, that you are our leaders in meteorology, our daily scientists that we interact with, that I need to keep learning about those points of interaction. But for me, a key piece of this is really, again, about caring for the most vulnerable globally, but then also, frankly, that gets overwhelming. So who's most vulnerable in my neighborhood? Who's most vulnerable in my county? And so, like you were saying, Kent, being situated here in Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota is my territory. And a really good member, a good portion of our membership is rural and really connected in really intimate ways to the land. And so holding on to those personal experiences, frankly, that don't always make the national news. So again, I love how you pulled us back to the local. We all are impacted by how we are connected to one another and to all of creation and the earth. And so finding ways to intersect our own activities with care and love and infusing every action of ours there is what my sense of call to caring for climate change and being aware and finding my voice and role in caring for all of that. So I'm excited to be here to answer questions and to be a part of sharing my experience and sense of passion here too. Thank you.
And now we hear from Dr. Sand. Jen.
Hi, yeah, I'm very happy to be here today. Chris, I definitely felt emotional hearing some of your presentation, just seeing all of the ways that you interacted on your forecasts over the years, and were so brave to show people, the severity of what was happening. And I think ultimately that a lot of us don't know how to handle and process our emotions, and that if you really take in the threat of climate change, it can be very overwhelming for people. And so if we don't know how to handle our emotions, and we don't know how to grieve, we don't know how to handle our anxiety and the threat that we feel, and that can just throw us into kind of a freeze response is the way I think of it, and where we just want to be ostriches and put our heads in the sand and not see what's going on. So I think for me, my call to climate action really began in more in a more active way 2 years ago when climate scientists raised the red alert and said, hey, things are really getting dangerous here. But I do think I have a background that just made me receptive to hearing that. My parents growing up in Decorah, my mom washed plastic baggies. My dad planted trees. Mom's on the call here. She's awesome. She does a great job with climate action. And I remember in high school hearing from my science teacher, Mr. Berland, that in 50 years we were going to be in a heap of trouble. And I remember like going, uh-oh, and kind of looking around and then like, okay, I don't really see a lot of action, or people aren't saying, hey, there's an emergency here. And so yeah, I kind of put my head in the sand. And then 2 years ago, I just got hit with a huge wave of anxiety, and I had to figure out what to do with that. It was keeping me up at night, my fears about climate change. And so I found Al Gore's organization, became a climate reality leader, was trained with 1,000 other people up in Minneapolis, which was incredible to see that number of people all, I don't even want to say believing, it's science and it's facts. So, but all who were like-minded, and that felt very relieving. And then through my posting on social media, found Iowa IPL, and I've been real proud to be a board member with this fantastic organization. But Reverend Stevens, you're talking about interconnection, and I think that is, I firmly believe that we're all interconnected, and not just humans to each other, but to the natural life around us, to animals, to plants, trees. And so if we are healthy individuals, I think that we feel more of that connection. And Claire, I believe that it was you that shared that poem at the beginning. And that's what I think that we need to do, is take those moments where we're feeling overwhelmed and just feel into the environment around us. And Chris, I feel like you've been so brave, and instead of putting your head in the sand, just really, I can't imagine how many hundreds of difficult conversations you've had over the course of your career, and that you keep doing that is fabulous. So thank you for letting us know what we can do to support you, because we really need to keep you going, because you're having the hard conversations every day with the viewers who need to hear the science. So
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Kent.
One of the words that came to mind listening to both Reverend Stevens and in turn Jen is lament, and an expression of grief or sorrow, a collective one in cases like when you're dealing with climate change, but also undertowing that expression of lament can be an unwavering faith. For some, it's drawing on one's source of courage. For people within particular faith traditions, the God. And so I think that, as is often the case when we are faced with injustices, a group like Iowa Interfaith Power and Light affords us an opportunity to come together in a much larger community. But knowing of those common interests allows us to have conversations outside of our normal smaller communities, and to be able to respond. Again, you almost have to have an expression of grief or sorrow for what we've already lost, but not to be paralyzed, but to rather have the courage to find the inner source. And you find it from within the greater community. Every time I have a conversation with my colleagues at IPL, I come away thinking of new ways to be involved and to reach out, so that it's not just, playing in one's own sandbox, so to speak. Chris, we've got a lot of questions that have come in, a lot of comments, if you're okay. And then likewise, Reverend Stevens and Jen, as you see fit, chime right in. There was a question about the ability to view the two documentaries. Is it possible, Chris, to provide that to IPL for those that are watching this either live or by recording?
Absolutely. I can also, if things are wrapping up and people want to stay in for a little bit, I can put in the links into the chat as well.
Another question is, does the station get hate mail for not showing the other side? I mean, that's a tough, because what I'm doing is connecting the dots here. I haven't really started doing stories like I did in Boston. So no, but at the same point, the hate mail that I'm getting and the station and my managers are getting frequently are the emails saying that I'm mentioning it too much, if that makes sense. So those 5 examples were just a typical day in the life of me throughout the week when, I mention it. So hope that answers it. Yeah. There's actually 2 comments or questions that have a theme to them. Folks interested in weather but not climate change, how do you engage particularly in rural areas? And then likewise, one of the attendees today spoke of time when they lived in Latin America, and the comment was rural folks there better understand climate change than most in the United States right now. So, I mean, I guess part of the first part of the question is how are you anticipating having conversations with folks in rural areas? I mean, you've done Saginaw and Albany, and that's not downtown New York City, but what are you anticipating, or not only maybe what will be your approach for having conversations with rural folks? And then kind of the extension of that is, how about us? What should we remember?
I think if you look at how the population is spread out across the country, it's largely focused along the coast. And that's been like that since we were first a country, because that's where ports are. That's how you get from goods from one point to the other in the world. Well, those areas are feeling the impacts like visually. I mean, when you have king tide flooding where roads are shut on a sunny day because of coastal flooding, like I saw in Boston, Miami sees constantly. The Tea Party invited Carrie Emanuel, one of the lead climate scientists, to go down and talk at a political event. He wasn't sure what he was getting into, but it was adamant supporters saying, what can we do? The newest congresswoman from South Florida, who is, I believe, a Tea Party Republican, just was talking about king tide flooding. So you have the 2 coasts that are seeing and feeling the impacts, and then the wildfires out west. There's the effect of, this is terribly cruel, I know, but if you take a frog and you put it into a pot and you turn up the pot, if it's on the stove, and that temperature gradually increases to a boil, that frog will not jump out of the pot. It will die in the pot. It'll be essentially cooked to death. That's what my biggest fear is in rural communities, because that's really the way that we're seeing it. Farmers are feeling it because it's affecting their bottom line. But for people just day to day, you're not going to necessarily know that it's a couple of degrees warmer over time. And that's that same effect of having a frog in a boiling pot of water. For us, we're turning up that temperature, and it may not seem that dramatic. So it's important to make sure that people understand that that's not just a hypothetical response, that's what our brains do too. We're saying, oh, well, it's not that much warmer. So I think that that's a difficult part in connecting the dots in places that aren't seeing and feeling the impacts as dramatically. But there are areas like Iowa, which are huge with wind, solar, and biofuels. And those are ways to, I think, get typically more conservative folks on board to understand that they can create their own energy. They can cut the cord with big utility companies. And I think that certainly can be an inspiring way with job potential, job growth, manufacturing jobs. And I was a little bit disheartened, not to go on a tangent, but quickly I'll finish this thought. In Iowa, I asked for an upcoming story to figure out how many people are employed by solar, in wind, and biofuels. But it's not. They don't actually have that data. It's how many people are in utilities, how many people are in manufacturing. The cynical side of me, I think I know the answer to that. But that data should be available because these are jobs and high-paying jobs that are easily retooled, and people can get a new skill set and get more for a safer job, which is pretty amazing. So I think that is a great way to get the rural communities involved, because those are the areas for wind, solar, and bio.
Mm-hmm. I would love to chime in here too, where I think this is an interesting place of intersection for faith leaders and community, because of the understanding of both the here and now, but also the eternal or larger sense of time, and also sense of place and being, right? So and this is what I think, hearkening back to my comment about privilege, I was born and raised in the suburbs in the United States, right? And so the whole culture that I've grown up in is really focused on the here and now, and what am I experiencing, and what can I have, what can I do personally, me, to build my life? But my faith informs me that I'm actually one little piece of a big, broad experience, right? And I think leaning in with your comment, Kent, about the folks in other settings that frankly have a better sense of or hold on the truth about climate change. I think often we see that they have a deeper connection to the eternal, and also to the not just sense of time in eternity, but also all of creation being connected. And I think when we lean in our, say, rural communities, but just in general, using the language of our faith and of legacy, and of seeing our place in the whole milieu and experience of humanity, we really have some tools at our fingertips there to lean in to care for what to honor what has come, what we've come with, and then to care for what will be in front of us.
I'm not originally from Iowa. I'm from Nebraska, but I've spent enough time in Iowa that I consider myself an Iowan. And this is kind of a comment for Chris. Once every 4 years, the entire country draws their attention on Iowa. And there will be people who are wanting you to vote for them in a caucus, but it affords our state an opportunity to have conversations. My thought, though, is that we as Iowans have conversations much more frequently than once every 4 years. And to be able to talk with fellow Iowans sensibly about matters, as we're based on our lived experience, is really where we have the potential. For example, this summer, we actually hosted a faith and business conversation in Iowa City, and Iowa Business for Clean Energy was a co-host. Now, they have a tendency to run kind of conservative on business practices, but in that moment where we could talk about climate change and the effects of it, we had a conversation with folks that we don't normally talk to. So it wasn't merely an echo chamber. So there, for me, there's great optimism that, and again, I'll revert back to all of the little liberal arts colleges in the state of Iowa. We have centers of thought and reflection in our local communities. That history of higher ed in the state of Iowa is a strong one. So too are the IPL student leaders that have been so instrumental in helping with this presentation and the statements. So there's a lot of great resources, Chris, to be aware of as you proceed. A question was posed: what led to the degree in emergency management? So we're hitting the rewind button on Chris's career, but it was fortuitous, but how'd you come about it?
Well, again, it was my non-traditional way of going from my bachelor's degree, taking a break for 12 years and then going back to school. But it was because of being on the ground after so many disasters. I enjoyed firefighting. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the firefighting community could do more in understanding the impacts of climate change, because I think that would be helpful for the entire profession. But when it comes to emergency management, I thought that would be a good way to come up with climate action plans for communities. So sad, my hometown, Sag Harbor, New York, the first mayor, I came up with a climate action plan just to be helpful, just because that's my hometown. She said, oh, well, I don't know if we can make any of these changes because I'm worried about the real estate agencies coming out against me. The second mayor that just won re-election, I sent him my climate action plan that I developed for my hometown, and I never responded. So a little disheartening, but that is what communities need to do. And I know, Rob, you know, as a state senator, you know, I encourage communities to make sure that they have a climate action plan. It's incredibly important. I know the derecho, there isn't enough evidence to maybe connect the dots with climate change. I think higher intensity storms like that are possible, but maybe not as frequently as we've seen before in the past. But regardless, with heat, with agriculture, you need to make plans going forward for communities to adjust to climate change and mitigate the impacts of climate change as well.
I've seen a couple of notes. Yeah, your point about Rob, by way of the chat, talking about the importance of being aware of what comes in Glasgow in November 1st to the 12th, and making sure that elected officials are doing what they're to be doing and ultimately to be held accountable. Additionally, I had a participant note. This was kind of a headline from a news source. Climate change poses a threat to Iowa's electric grid. Scientists are calling for infrastructure investments. So just as Texas can have a cold snap and have it be a peculiar one and affect the grid down there and put particularly people living in poverty in harm's way immediately, it appears as though Iowa also has to be mindful of that as well. Let's see. I think I'm running up against time, and so I'm going to stop and see if my colleagues that are.
I do like, and this one's for Reverend Stevens. It's not in the Q&A. It's actually in the chat.
Okay.
Reverend, I don't know if you can see that.
Oh,
but how
sure.
can we?
I
think
did,
that's right.
and I was just starting to type in, but I'm happy to share it here and say that I would echo. No, it's all right. I was just going to echo a bunch of your words, Chris, which is to continue to connect the dots. So the question in the chat was, how can we engage our faith leaders to more strongly help their parishioners recognize their responsibility to preserve creation and help the least among us? I think so. At some point, this is about really about strategy and tactics of how to help encourage and empower humans to take what they believe in their head and their heart and make it come alive in their actions and in their daily life, right? And so, frankly, being willing to have more and more conversations, like you said, Kent, we have the unique opportunity here in Iowa, which to kind of be on a national stage, having these exciting conversations, but really each of us, even in our backyard interactions, right, at the barbecues that we have in our neighborhoods or at our PTA meetings, to say out loud, even just to ask the question out loud, I wonder who isn't here today and who needs caring for, and how we could make the connection. Right. So even just asking those questions, or to say out loud, kind of in your direction, Dr. Sands, I'm feeling really sad about this and I don't want to get stuck there. So like just honoring and naming it out loud in the little teeny ways, at least in my own faith experience and life experience, is the more that I do that, the easier it is to go the next route, to be a little bit bolder and a little bit louder and a little bit bigger in what I do. Right. So that would be my hope, is to continue connecting those dots.
Real quick, Jen, and I know we're running out of time, but I want to ask a question. I mean, like, again, I've gotten a thick skin over 16 years, but how can people get help, and how important is it to get help? I mean, when you're slammed after hate email, it's disheartening. But there's also people that are doing climate action that get harassed. How do you get help?
Well, how do you get help? I mean, certainly, finding a therapist locally who understands the climate science and can help you process the emotions that you might have about that. But I also think, for you, obviously in the public eye, or people who are doing climate action in such a way that they are, getting a lot of hate. I think that it's really important, and obviously as a recovering people pleaser myself, like just the idea of boundaries, and that I think it's really important to take in information and feedback from people who are trusted in our own individual lives, and then to develop really good boundaries with people whose judgment we just don't trust in the same way. And I follow a variety of like authors and things like that who are in the public eye, and online hate is really rough, I think. And I think as much as possible, obviously for you, Chris, you've got to hear this stuff. I'm sure your bosses are talking to you about it, but if you can turn those off and not read them, I think the online thing is really, really tough. But I think understanding your own boundaries and practicing some grounding, and just reconnecting to, either your own faith or your own inner connection to people who are important to you, and realizing where you need to take feedback in and where you need to just keep it out.
Awesome.
I guess those are my thoughts.
I think the other thing too, and I get a fair amount of negative response when we talk about care for creation. I think the thing that helps me keep at it is understanding that this is a global matter, and that it is often the world's poorest who are adversely affected the harshest. So the mission work, or the connections we have, and the indigenous voices, the local lived experience, whether it be in the Philippines or southern Madagascar that hasn't had rain in 2 years. These are all things that I can turn back and say, this is not this is not my thing. I mean, it's not all about me. It's about the world's poor and how they're being affected. And you'll also hear folks talk about the developed world. The debt is on us because of how we've consumed. And so, just being very mindful of those that are very vulnerable and don't have the means to mitigate in the same way we do. There was another person that asked about, I think the question was, if a local central Iowa emergency group doing effective work on climate emergency group. The state of Iowa has local agencies active in recovery. Iowans are pretty good at planning for certain disasters and then responding to them. It may be the case that same group, and I know that there's a meteorological connection with them, is also somebody that can be engaged more, particularly as we see more indicators of what's happening. So, Chris, I know you're involved at the national level. My hope for you is that you find an inviting cohort group in Iowa as well, with the different sectors, including emergency preparedness and response.
Absolutely. Hope. Thanks.
Now I'm going to check with my colleagues at IPL. There he is.
Yeah. All right. I want to say thank you, Chris and Jen and Kent and Reverend Stevens. This has been really amazing. And thank you to all the participants for your great questions and your passion and for showing up today. We're running just a few minutes long, and I know people may have to leave, but I appreciate people sticking around because we want to send out some additional thank yous, and we want to bring our students back in. So we're maybe around a couple minutes long today. I also want to thank somebody you're not seeing today, but she's very much involved, and that is our Associate Director, Irene Damaris. And she is, as we all kind of are in this season of cold and flu, she's feeling miserable right now. But she has stepped up and continued to run all of the back end of this so that the webinar works and everybody keeps moving forward. So you're not seeing Irene today. She's not feeling well at all, but she's very much present and doing the work to make this happen. So I want to lift up her amazing leadership and her all that she does for Iowa IPL. You're not seeing her today, but you're seeing the work of her hands and the spirit in her. On behalf of Iowa Interfaith Power and Light, we thank these schools who've been part of our Call to Climate Action and have participated this semester, right? So right now, currently as part of this, Iowa State, Coe College, Cornell, Clark University, and the University of Iowa. We look forward to welcoming more schools as we continue to grow Call to Climate Action next year. Additionally, we want to thank the following for providing financial support to Iowa Interfaith Power and Light and our investment in Iowa College student leadership. The Amy P. Goldman Foundation and the Sisters of St. Francis in Clinton. We also want to thank Alice, a Canadian charitable organization. We've been partnering with them on empowering farmers and ranchers to build nature on the land. And they provided some support for our student leaders this summer. And I want to lift up Clara Miller. I think we might put this in the chat, but you can also Google it. You'll also probably be seeing it from our social media and emails in the coming days. Her piece about farmer leadership on climate action appeared last night in the Des Moines Register, and we expect it to be in print possibly tomorrow. So thank you for that. The balance of support for this important work with young people comes from the investments made by faith-based and secular organizations, congregations, and houses of worship, and individuals. So thank all of you. And many of you have already made a contribution to this work. Thank you. We invite others to make a financial contribution to support faith-based student leadership for bold and just climate action as well. You can do that online at iowaipl.org/donate, or just Iowa IPL and find the donate button. You'll also be getting a follow-up email next week thanking you for participating today, and that will include information about supporting the work as well. Thank you again for all of you who support this important work of Iowa IPL. We will now hear from Clara and Parker, who will introduce the 2021-2022 Faith Statement, Awe-Inspiring World. They wrote this in partnership with some faith leaders around the state. We thank everyone who has already taken time to sign it and encourage others to sign as well. Clara and Parker, please take it away.
Hello, everyone. While Parker and I were writing our 2021-22 faith statement, we wanted to create a call for collaboration and community. As we were working on this statement in a time where COVID-19 restrictions seemed to be lifting, we wanted to encourage humanity to set aside their differences and to move forward and face the challenge of the climate crisis together. We will accomplish more as a community rather than divided.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to read the faith statement that we wrote now. So we titled it Awe-Inspiring Climate Action. And we said, we live in an awe-inspiring world. As people of faith and conscience, we are left to envision a future for all people to sustain and live in a happy, healthy, and sustainable community. We have an opportunity to revolutionize how we live together as we prepare for a post-pandemic world. In this unique time, we are called to admire, engage, protect, and participate in shaping our future. We have the opportunity to revitalize the relationship we have with the environment and to empower our communities. The desire to preserve and protect the earth comes from a love of all people. Creation provides all that we need. And then we said that we are called to gather. Since people gathered in a community are stronger than the individual. The battle against the climate crisis group is a group effort. It is essential to lift up all people as we move forward together. And we need to gather to accomplish advancements in technology, lift up the less fortunate, and move towards social justice. We're called to seek, which means to actively search for how to better the integrity of one's character and community. This means to think in a dynamic manner centered on positive change. To seek in a productive way means to curiously run towards all that is good. And we're called to be stewards. Stewardship is to work with the natural world, and we are called to ensure that our systems not only provide for humankind, but also for all life on Earth. It is necessary that we cultivate a healthy future for generations to come. And we're called to love one another. Love is to give what we can when we can and recognize where help is needed. A charitable person will seek ways to help others in addition to giving without expecting anything in return. We're called for humility as well. Humility helps us move from a mindset of scarcity to an abundant and healthy community. Humility means putting ourselves aside and devoting our energy to causes that need it. By living humbly, supporting others is a greater priority and leads to a healthier world and environment. We're called to regenerate. Regeneration is how we restore our shared world, which is good, plentiful, and just. This means rebuilding our spiritual foundations together, and faith leads us to respect and care for our community and environment. To do this, it is essential to tackle injustices to journey towards healing and repair. And we are called to be resilient. Resilience means to stay grounded in faith despite facing challenges and to maintain the ability to be faithful. We must be resilient to regenerate a resilient future. And we are called to lead. Leadership is to encompass all of the characteristics above. To exhibit leadership, one is required to be humble, charitable, resilient, always seeking to improve both themselves and the community. To be a leader, we must be proactive and look out for others around us and lift them to thrive. All of us carry the responsibility to halt the climate crisis and challenge the political system standing in the way of climate action. Together, we can unite and face a challenge greater than ourselves, and we are able to achieve much more than we can do alone. We have been called to serve our community by lifting up our neighbors and supporting a healthy and sustainable society. In this unique and changing time, we have to revolutionize how we live. We are called to unite as one in order to sustain a healthy and thriving planet to secure our future. As people of faith, we embrace the necessary actions that lead to a world of abundance. And you guys might have noticed Allie Parker shared the URL in the chat, and we encourage everyone to sign and add your name to the list.
All right. Thank you, Clara and Parker. It's been such an honor to work with you this summer, and that you've continued to do this voluntarily to help us to do all of this work. One of my favorite things in being at Iowa IPL has been working with these young leaders. And this is the third faith statement that they have written. We don't write this, they write it, we help them. And every year something pops, or I go back and things will pop. And today I want to share what popped for me in listening to this. To curiously run towards all that is good. I've known faith leaders all my life. And the amazing things that these young emerging leaders, the words they put together and the concepts that they elevate are really amazing. Think about that. To curiously run towards all that is good. Thank you, Clara and Parker, and all of the past Call to Climate Action student leaders. Now, as we close, I would like to invite you, as you are moved by your own faith and conscience, together, let us pray and reflect. Source of all being, empower us to take climate action. Energize us to be humble, resilient, and hopeful as we invite others into climate action. Call us to embrace the abundant gifts of creation as we develop solutions to climate change. And let us go forth to inspire others to help solve the climate crisis. May it be so. Thank you all. Thank you all for taking time out of your weekend to join us. And please save the date. Our next event is a book club event on November 9th. It'll be 6 p.m. virtual again, but we'll be discussing climate scientist Dr. Katherine Hayhoe's new book, Saving Us. And you can find that on our website. You'll be getting it in emails, but you can register and join us for this discussion, because as Katherine says, the most important thing we can do is talk about this, because when we talk about climate change, we make a difference, and we make people like Chris Gloninger, who's ready to lead, we empower him to do that when we talk about it. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the weekend. We look forward to staying engaged as we are all called to climate action.